Alright folks, it's time for us to jump back into my Destiny 2 subclass tier list video series. We're up to episode 6 now, and we've talked about a lot, so if you missed any of the previous ones, there's a link in the top right you can click on right now. In the first video, we went over the criteria I'll be using to tier each subclass branch, and of course we had a good time, which is exactly what we're going to do today as we add the Titan's final subclass branch, the Sunbreaker, to the list. Let's get started. Just like always, before we start adding new branches to the list, we have to look at the universal mechanics. For the Sunbreaker, we have 2 class abilities, Rally Barricade and Towering Barricade, 3 lift types, Strafe Lift, High Lift, and Catapult Lift, and 3 grenades, the Thermite Grenade, Fusion Grenade, and Incendiary Grenade. With those universal mechanics in mind, we're going to start things off with the Sunbreaker's top branch, the Code of the Fireforged. Your melee ability is Hammer Strike. While sprinting, press your melee button to charge forward and deal damage, apply a burn in an area of effect, and increase enemy damage taken. Next, the passive ability Tempered Metal causes solar ability kills to grant you and nearby allies increased movement and reload speed. Vulcan's Rage is a passive that affects your super. Your Hammer of Soul hammers shatter into explosive molten embers on impact. Finally, Explosive Pyre is another passive for your super. Enemies killed by Hammer of Soul explode. This subclass branch is stuck in a different era of Destiny. While the rest of the game has evolved and become more challenging, some subclass branches were adjusted to meet those demands. This one stayed mostly the same, and it hasn't aged well. First and foremost, the Fireforged runs into many of the same problems I've talked about for CQC Titan branches, namely Destiny 2's lack of defensive options. Its best ability is Hammer Strike, and it's a melee. So if you want to get the most out of this branch, you have to put your life on the line, and most of the time, you're gonna lose it. The worst part of this is, the rewards for your sacrifice aren't worth it because there are easier ways to get them. Defense down debuffs aren't incredibly common in Destiny 2, but every other way to apply that debuff is easier and more efficient than having the Code of Leroy Jenkins charge at a boss to bunk it with a flaming hammer. These problems are exacerbated by the branch's inability to regenerate health or crowd control enemies with its base abilities, and the subclass itself not having any exotics that provide that. The top branch of the Striker, the Code of the Earthshaker, can get health regeneration from melee ability kills through the Insurmountable Skull Fort, and it has flashbang grenades for crowd control. The bottom branch of the Sentinel, the Code of the Aggressor, doesn't have any health regen in its abilities or exotics, but its Shield Bash melee crowd controls enemies at the point of impact. It also has a suppression grenade for crowd control. The Fireforged has Piss and Vinegar, and the Cabal don't care about that. They're gonna shoot you and you're gonna die. Regrettably, the rest of the Fireforged kit isn't any better. Tempered Metal is a cool group buff, reload speed and movement speed increases are always nice, but it doesn't have any place on this branch. Reload speed has no synergy with the Code of the Fireforged's desire to charge into battle and live long enough to capitalize on the targets it weakens. Also, the way Tempered Metal is applied doesn't make sense with the Code of the Fireforged. I'm not a genius by any stretch of the imagination. I know because I spelt genius wrong in the script, but I can tell you this for certain. A stackable buff that's built up by killing enemies with abilities on a subclass branch that doesn't have any cooldown reduction in its base kit is a terrible idea. Without an exotic armor piece or a very strong build to help with your CDR, it's literally impossible to keep Tempered Metal running for a meaningful amount of time, and that's important because the buff isn't that strong. It's like how melee abilities should find a balance between damage and utility, buffs need to find a balance between their duration, their effect, and the potency of that effect. I'll put it to you like this: if Tempered Metal made me feel like a god for its duration, I wouldn't mind it being difficult to build up or maintain. But it makes my guns reload faster, and Destiny isn't wanting for more ways to do that. Also, the movement speed increase is pretty negligible. Lastly, the Hammer of Soul super doesn't feel great. It looks spectacular, but its ability to clear out packs of enemies can be inconsistent depending on their spacing, and the damage against single targets is respectable, but it's not top tier, and it barely makes the middle of the road. All of this combines together to leave me feeling very sad. I hate to say it, but the Code of the Fireforged has landed itself in F tier. I would genuinely never recommend this subclass branch. Everything it does can be done better, and everything it doesn't do that well. Next up, we're going to talk about the Sunbreaker's bottom branch, the Code of the Siegebreaker. Your melee ability is Mortar Blast. On hit, you release a solar explosion that burns nearby enemies. Sol Invictus is a passive ability. It causes solar ability kills to restore your health. Also, Grenade, melee ability, and Sun Warrior kills leave a deadly sunspot in their wake. Sun Warrior is another passive. Passing through a sunspot causes your grenade and melee abilities to recharge faster and your super to last longer. It also increases all of your outgoing damage. Finally, Endless Siege is a passive that affects your super. Your Hammer of Soul hammers create a sunspot on impact, and while standing in a sunspot, you throw hammers faster. The code of the Siegebreaker has also been around since the launch of Destiny 2, but this branch has been tuned and updated to keep up with the times. In its current form, it's one of the most satisfying subclass branches to play. Sol Invictus and Sun Warrior have my favorite ability interactions in the game. Turning enemies into a sunspot creates tons of incredible opportunities for you. It's area denial from melee enemies and persistent damage on a crowd mixed with minors and majors. You kill the little guys and the big guys sit in the fire and get extra crispy. But then we add Sun Warrior into the mix and it creates a gameplay loop. You can chuck a grenade across the map and score a beautiful kill, but you're not playing the Siegebreaker right if you don't take a page from Icarus's book and try to get to the sun. I love chasing down sunspots to keep the Sun Warrior buff active, not just because it's fun to imagine my Titan enjoying the heat, but because it's super effective to do so. This buff is packed with cooldown reduction and damage to your weapons and abilities, so not having it means you're missing out on a lot of potential. To make things even better, the sunspots, Sol Invictus, and Sun Warrior have a fun interaction with the Titan's class ability. Let's elaborate on that. If you kill an enemy with a grenade, there's a good chance that enemy is out of cover. But the Titans can make their own cover with barricades. So, while there's always going to be risk associated with running towards a newly created sunspot, you can keep the really dangerous ones covered with a barricade. What's even cooler is sunspots last longer while you're standing in them, so you can milk the duration for longer while keeping it safe with the barricade. With regards to exotic, the Siegebreaker has great synergy with all the Sunbreaker specific exotics. They each enhance the potency of the different aspects of the branch's base kit in valuable ways. The Hollowfire Heart's exotic perk provides cooldown reduction for your solar abilities that stacks on top of Sun Warrior, allowing you to use a silly amount of abilities. The Ashen Wake exotic gloves has a perk that changes your fusion grenade to explode on impact and refunds cooldown when you kill enemies. It provides the grenade's ease of use and it lets you make better split-second decisions about how you eliminate targets. Finally, the Phoenix Cradle exotic boots increases the duration of Sun Warrior and lets allies claim the buff too, making you into a phenomenal offensive support character. It's just a shame that these boots are kinda ugly. The only truly negative aspect of the code of the Siegebreaker is its melee. It does the same amount of damage as a normal punch on hit, and the burn it applies is weak too, but like the code of the Commander's Tactical Strike, it feels like it's supposed to be a setup instead of a punchline. Hitting targets with Mortar Blast and killing them while they're burning is an easy way to make sunspots against close-range targets. Even still, I wish it did more damage. It feels like, at the very least, the target that I punch in the face with a flaming fist should get completely cooked. The last thing to mention for the code of the Siegebreaker is the super. It falls into the middle of the road with a lot of the roaming supers in Destiny 2, but because this subclass branch has such an amazing neutral game that is all the time you spend without your super, I'm not bothered by it. So, I think you can guess by now that the Siegebreaker is pretty high on the tier list, but it's not all the way at the top. It's gonna fall into the A tier. It has a phenomenal neutral game, and it can use abilities more frequently than almost any other class in the game, and this is before we throw exotics into the mix. But to be S tier, you've got to be on a whole nother level, and the code of the Siegebreaker just isn't there, and the main thing that's holding it back is its super. It's just not as good as it needs to be. Even still, I would wholeheartedly recommend you take this subclass branch into any content in the game, because it will serve you well. Last but certainly not least, we're going to wrap things up with the Sunbreaker's middle branch, the code of the Devastator. Its melee ability is Throwing Hammer. It allows you to throw a flaming hammer. After throwing it, you can pick up the hammer to fully recharge your melee ability. Tireless Warrior is a passive that affects your hammer. After hitting an enemy with it, picking it up triggers health regeneration. Roaring Flames is another passive ability. Kills with your solar abilities increases those abilities' damage, and this buff can be stacked up to 3 times. Finally, your super is Burning Maul. You summon a giant flaming hammer, and you can crush your enemies with the force of an earthquake. That's what the description says. I didn't make that up. Now, the Code of the Devastator is the best subclass branch in the game, but it's also the worst subclass in the game. But most of the time, it's pretty average. This one is a little bit complicated to talk about. Unlike every other Titan subclass branch, the Code of the Devastator is actually kind of difficult to play, but all of the challenges you face are heavily rewarded. Your melee ability Throwing Hammer and its associated passive Tireless Warrior form the gameplay loop for this branch. You kill an enemy with the hammer, pick it up, reset the cooldown, and trigger health regeneration. If you've seen the previous Titan episodes, then you already know I'm gonna say health regen sucks when you're fighting in close quarters, or in this case when you're chasing after your Throwing Hammer, because it gets interrupted when you take damage. But with the Devastator, things feel a little bit different. I'm not saying I wouldn't prefer a fixed amount of regeneration on pickup, but believe it or not, the Devastator isn't a CQC Titan branch. It fights best at mid-range and around cover, and at those distances, regeneration doesn't feel bad. While it's tempting and possible to go on a rampage with the Baby Hammer, it's best used as a defense against nearby enemies that are pushing you, so retrieving it doesn't mean instant death. On that note, the Baby Hammer punches above its weight when you build up stacks of Roaring Flames. So in the end, it's a powerful offense and defense packed into a tiny package. Let's stay on Roaring Flames for a minute. It is literally the strongest ability damage buff in the game when it reaches maximum stacks. What that means is the Code of the Devastator is in possession of the strongest single target melee ability in the game while your buffs are active. That also means you have the highest damaging grenades in the game. That also means while you have the buff active, your Burning Maul Super does top tier damage, though I'll be the first to admit that it has some issues staying on target. All of that says a lot of good about the Devastator's quality, but none of that comes without caveats. Building up and maintaining your stacks of Roaring Flames is something you genuinely have to work at, but thankfully this buff is something you can maintain 100% of the time because of Throwing Hammer and Tireless Warrior. With that said, landing kills with the Throwing Hammer can be tricky because enemies in Destiny are decently evasive, and one bad throw can send your pride and joy spiraling off a cliff and put you into a lengthy cooldown with no way to reduce it. Another struggle you'll find with this subclass is having your buffs active at the right time. This puts a pretty high skill ceiling on the Code of the Devastator, but a skill ceiling and challenges don't make a subclass branch bad. In fact, I personally like playing classes that are easy to learn but hard to master. I've spent a lot of time trying to perfect my play with the Code of the Devastator, and every step of the way has been a rewarding journey. I don't think I've ever reached the pinnacle, but along the way, I've grown to appreciate its strengths and respect its weaknesses. I'd be silly if I said this subclass branch didn't have any kinks. Like all the Titan subclass branches, health regen should be swapped with fixed health restoration. It's not easy to play because you need to aim your Throwing Hammer, then retrieve it and repeat the process throughout an entire strike, or an entire dungeon, ideally not missing any throws. Good luck with that. And finally, Destiny overall needs ways for players to spec their armor and mods for defense so the true CQC subclass branches can survive and thrive. And the Devastator won't have to feel so bad about running into enemy fire to retrieve its one true love, the Baby Hammer. But despite those negatives, its superior damage output keeps it from falling into obscurity. The Code of the Devastator has managed to smash its way into A tier with brute force alone. It'll always be tough to play, but it'll always hit hard enough to justify its place. And there we go, we are officially finished adding the Titan to our tier list. The Sunbreaker didn't get any S tiers, but overall it wound up being pretty good. Unfortunately, the top branch, the Code of the Fireforged, is complete trash and it's not worth playing right now. But I have hope that maybe one day it'll at least be C tier. Unless it gets a full rework, then I don't imagine it's going to be very good ever, especially with the way Destiny is currently balanced. With that said, we've got 3 more subclass branches to add to the list, and they all belong to the Hunter. But the question is, which Hunter subclass branch are we going to add to the tier list first? Well, that is up to you to decide. There is going to be a poll on the community tab for iBluairJgR where you can vote on which Hunter subclass branch you would like to see added to the tier list first. With all of that said, if you've been enjoying this series and you'd like to support the channel more than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting, you can head over to patreon.com/iBluairJgR to become a patron. As always, the name of the game is Destiny 2, the name of the channel is iBluairJgR. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.